Hi, this is Abul Hussein coming to you live and direct from London, the United Kingdom. And I have a very special guest joining me today who's going to talk to us about selling into the media and all about PR. Now, before I introduce her, if you are watching this video outside of our Facebook group, and that is the free community for social media marketing agencies, find the link and do click in there below. So today I'm joined by Hasina Momtaz, who is an entrepreneur. She's the founder of Soul Gems London, and she has also worked with the current Prime Minister when he was serving as the Mayor of London in his press team. So she is a bona fide comms guru, and hopefully she'll give us a couple of tips in how we can get featured in publications such as Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, or if you're in the UK, the Evening Standard and many of the other tabloids here. So without further ado, Hasina Momtaz, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Abul. How are you? Thank you so much for inviting me on.
No, thank you very much for joining us, because I know you're very busy, because
Sure.
you've had quite a bit of a stellar career. You know, you've served under mayors, you've served under the current Prime Minister, you're an entrepreneur, you have worked in the kind of not-for-profit sector. So why don't you give us a bit of an introduction in terms of who you are and what you do?
Well, you've already mentioned the Mayor of London, so maybe I'll pick up from there. So I started in the Mayor's office in 2003, and I was there for almost 9 years. I initially worked with Ken Livingstone. He was the independent mayor at the time when I joined. In 2004, there was an election, and he stood then as a Labour candidate. And then in 2008, Boris became the new incumbent at City Hall. So I had a really brilliant opportunity actually in that time to work with two very different administrations that came from very different sort of political ideologies and philosophies. I left the Mayor's office in 2011 and became Deputy Head of News at the Local Government Association, where I had a team of 8 or 9 press officers and an editor and a web team. And then I left there and went on to TfL in 2012, just before the London 2012 Games. So again, that was a fantastic opportunity to advise at the most senior levels at Transport for London during, it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I got to go to the opening of the Paralympic Games. So that was an amazing experience. I left there. I was on a 1-year contract, which got extended by another year. And in that time, I kind of had the opportunity to carry on doing PR, but I also had an opportunity to work in stakeholder engagement and internal communications. So that really helped to broaden out and flesh out my communications experience, which later stood me in good stead when I joined Islamic Relief UK in 2016. Islamic Relief, as we know, is one of the biggest international NGOs, Muslim NGOs in the world. And I joined there in 2016 as Media Relations Manager. And about 6 months later, I was given a fantastic opportunity. I became interim head of communications, and I did that for a year before leaving. So that's kind of a summary of my career.
Yeah, I know. Like I say, you've got a whole lot of PR and media relations experience behind you. Now, everybody's going to be wondering, right? You've worked directly with Boris Johnson. He knows your first name. What was it like working with the current Prime Minister?
So when Boris came in 2008, it was a very, very challenging time, both in terms of the kind of the media and the political landscape. Boris was elected on a manifesto commitment to tackle crime and policing in London. This was against the backdrop of, I think at that point there had been about 15 youth stabbings and murders in the capital. I was on the strategy desk and I looked after crime and policing. So there was a lot of pressure to deliver right from the beginning. Across the kind of press team, there was a lot of pressure to deliver because Boris came in with an ideology that everything should be self-financing. It's the conservative philosophy, things should be self-financing. So a lot of the marketing team well, the marketing team became very streamlined, let's say, which put a lot of pressure on the press team to get PR and to get coverage. The other kind of key thing was it was a transition period, so he didn't have his kind of team around him. So it was every day you'd be sort of dealing with somebody different from central office. So you'd kind of build up a relationship with somebody, and then a week later they'd be gone and somebody else would come in, and then you have to start that process again. So that was quite challenging. I think the key was winning trust, because we had a new administration. The previous administration had been a Labour one. A lot of us worked for that administration. And so we had to prove that we could be trusted, that we were politically neutral. In terms of working with Boris himself, as you said, he knew me by my first name. He was very enjoyable. I mean, I learned a lot working with a new administration with a completely different kind of philosophy. The media that we approached and targeted changed. We were no longer sort of going straight for the Guardian, for example. We were now dealing with reporters from the Times and the Telegraph and that kind of thing. But Boris was very personable to work for. He was very receptive to advice, and yeah, it was a time where I felt that I learned a lot, and it was a really enjoyable experience as well. So yeah, it was a great 4 years.
Great. Now let's leave the world of politics behind and kind of transition into the world of business. Because we're talking about PR and we're talking about getting media coverage, which is not I suppose, an attractive topic as it is running traditional advertising and marketing campaigns. And often what you find with small businesses is that they neglect PR, press relations, media relations, and they opt for advertising. So what do you think are the key benefits for a small business to be actually proactively investing in PR?
So advertising, so there's a very old saying, actually, I was reminded of it today, that advertising is what you pay for and publicity is what you pray for. So advertising obviously is paid media and PR is earned media. And the benefits of that, the obvious benefit is advertising you have to pay for. If you're a small business, then you're not going to have access to unlimited funds. So getting PR is one way of getting your name out there, raising brand awareness without having to pay for it. The other key benefit, I would say, is advertising is what you say about yourself, but PR is what other people say about you. And so it carries more credibility, it carries more weight. It's, just like word of mouth. So those are the key reasons why you might go for PR over advertising. It's kind of budget and credibility. The other thing with advertising is obviously you might reach new audiences through that publication's readership or through that broadcaster's, various audiences. So, then that's another reason, because to kind of target those audiences through advertising would be extremely costly. So that would be another reason why.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think businesses to actually struggle to get coverage in the media?
I think because businesses tend to focus on the business rather than on telling a story, whereas the media tells stories. That's what they're interested in. So if you have a really interesting story, and everybody has a story, because if you're an entrepreneur, you've gone through a journey, you've gone through a process to get there, and there's a reason you're doing what you're doing. And so it's how do you package that up as an interesting story for a journalist? And the other reason is probably because people haven't done their homework. So they're not targeting the right journalists on that publication. I mean, each publication might have, they've got a news desk, but they've also got a business journalist, they've got a features editor. So if you've done your homework, you can find different ways. You may not have a news story, but it may be something that the features editor is interested in. So it's doing your homework, and it's reading around and really knowing those media outlets and knowing who their audience is and why that audience would be interested in hearing about your story or hearing about your product. How is it going to benefit them? So those are probably the key reasons, and that, you know, they're not approaching the right media outlets at the right time. And sometimes it's just a case of that's the right publication, it's the right journalist, but they're just not interested in that story, and you're going to get a knockback. Because every, you know, the BBC, Evening Standard, they get hundreds of press releases a day, and that's not an exaggeration. They literally get hundreds of press releases a day, and they can only, you know, on the BBC and the main news, they can only run maybe 6 or 7 stories, and if they've already got one business story, they're not going to be looking for another one. So it may just not be the right time, and you might get a knockback. So what I would say is, in that time, you know, don't let it dishearten you. To take that as a learning experience. And you know, it may be that the time wasn't right then, but you go back in 3 months' time with a different angle, a different, you know, you've got a new product coming out, and that journalist has been writing about something, a problem or something that people are facing, and then the product that you have then solves that problem. You can then approach that journalist. Also use that time to cultivate relationships with journalists, to make sure you keep your, you know, your contacts list updated, to make sure that, you know, you're keeping your contacts live and keeping in touch with them. It may be just something like dropping that, you know, you've seen a news story that they've done, or you know, a story on something, and, you know, just dropping them a note and just saying, hey, I thought that was really good, you know, but be sincere, because they will see through it if you're not being authentic. You know, they might actually reply back to us and say, well, what did you like about that story? So be sincere, but you know, we all like praise, so journalists won't mind you dropping them a note to say you really thought that was a great story, and then try and link it into what you're doing. So yeah, that's kind of what I'd say.
And you've kind of hit a very good point there, that this is all about selling stories, because the media is going to kind of want to use the best stories and not just pitch a business to their audience, right? How could someone craft an attractive story that would, I suppose, have a better possibility of being picked up by an editor or a journalist?
Well, I mean, it goes without saying, make the story interesting, make it relatable. People love human interest stories, but also bear in mind that journalists are very busy people. This came from an agency, I think, a few years ago, but on any one day, a national newspaper, you know, journalist is working on 10 to 15 stories and leads and things. But if you can give him a story, you know, a package on a plate that makes his life easier, he's more likely to go with your story. So how you would package it up then, you would, obviously you have your narrative, but you need to contextualize it. So, you know, contextualize it with some interesting facts and figures. So for example, for me, I might think, well, how many other Muslim women are there in business? You know, so I might draw up some, you know, some interesting facts around that. Try and find some case studies, because journalists, as you say, that's another way of telling the story. And then it's a third, you know, a third party perspective. It's not just what you're saying about yourself or your brand, but if you can find somebody, so if you've got a product and someone has used it, and I don't know, they had, say, for example, a skin condition or something, and it's made a significant difference, you know, ask that person if you can use them as a case study for your press release. Of course, as I said before, make sure that you target it to the appropriate media outlet. If you're a niche product, think about not just trying to get in the Guardian or, you know, the Evening Standard or the Metro. Think about the vertical media. So which are the specialist publications in your area? So say, for example, if your product is something to do with fishing, for example, then, you know, think about those specialist publications. Think about the local press in your area that you might target. And what else would I say? You know, have great images to send to the media. The media will not run a story without an image. If it's for broadcast, then be prepared. You know, they might ask you for an interview. So, you know, write up some key messages, do a little bit of interview prep. And, you know, see who else can be an advocate for you. So it's not always you selling the story about yourself. As I said, think of advocates that you can use. People that have used your product, people that have used your service, that kind of thing. And think about, how does your product or your service benefit society? And how can you tell that story? Try and link it to things like specific events. So if there's, for example, I know a lady recently who created a sort of sports hijab, and she linked it to World Hijab Day. And as a result of that, actually managed to get herself on ITV London. So think about things kind of on the broader landscape that are happening. You know, every single day is an international day for something. So if whatever you're selling, there's going to be an international day for that thing or something in the industry. And just keep abreast with what's going on, you know, in your specific industry, and use those things as hooks or as angles for selling your story to the media.
No, that's great. So, I mean, in terms of resources available, you know, what resources can someone access who is trying to get coverage in the media?
Do you mean by sort of what sort of tools they might use and that sort of thing? So, I mean, there are the tools that that you have to pay for and you have to subscribe to. So there are things like Corkana, but you have to pay for those things, and that gives you access to databases of journalists and, you know, lots of information. But then there's also the kind of tools that you can create for yourself. So one of the things I would do is have a media grid, and I would try and plot a timeline for things that could give me potential hooks for a story. I might plot which journalists I want to target on that. As I said before, just do your legwork and find out who the key journalists are who are writing about the things that you want to talk about, and build up that database as well. Utilize your contacts, build up the contacts list, as I've said, and then use all the various different platforms like LinkedIn, like Twitter, you know, Facebook, and use the right tool for the right message. So if you're wanting to do, say, a thought leader piece, then LinkedIn might be more appropriate. And if you're wanting to, I don't know, offer a time limited discount on your product or your service, then use maybe Twitter or something like that. So just think about what the appropriate platform is as well.
Sure.
Not just for your brand, but also for your content, that specific piece of content as well.
That makes total sense. So, I mean, final question for you before I let you go, because I know you've been quite generous with your time here. If I was a small business, let's kind of bring this more local, more regional, and I'm trying to sell a story and get coverage in my local paper. You know, what are some of the steps that I need to do to get coverage? So from finding a story to writing a press release, I mean, what logical steps would I need to follow to ensure that I get my story in front of the right people?
Okay, so think about first what your story is, and that's, what are you trying to communicate? What do you want people to take away? So, and that's actually another difference between advertising and PR, is you can't control the story, whereas with advertising you can control it because you're paying for it. So think about the best possible way to position yourself or your brand or your product. And then in terms of the practical steps that you might take would be to draft a press release. And in that you would talk about your brand, tell your story, as I say, contextualize it with some facts and figures, use some appropriate suitable quotations, and then you would obviously send it out to the journalist. And I'm afraid that's where the hard work really begins, because as I said, you know, your press release will get lost amongst so many other press releases. Talking to journalists, that's the absolute key. I mean, I've got stories in just from being persistent and calling journalists up and briefing them, and you know, they've not even seen the press release because they've been rushing about on a story, blah blah blah. So draw it to their attention, tell them why they should, what makes this an interesting story. Tell them what else you can offer them by way of case studies, really, interesting images, and have that conversation with them. Ask them what they need. And if you've done your homework, you'll know who the right journalists are to target, the ones who are likely to be interested in your story. And then obviously, just see if you just be persistent. So I would say be professional, because nobody wants to deal with someone who's unprofessional. So if you've promised that you're going to send something to a journalist, you're going to follow up with some specific images that they've asked for, make sure that you send them. Be persistent, but bear in mind, obviously, that they're very busy people. And be personable. I would say that those are my 3 Ps, because people like to deal with people that are nice to deal with. None of us wants to deal with people who are grumpy. And just have, I would have some key points written down on a notepad that I want to brief the journalist on. So those are some of the sort of processes you might go through.
Perfect. Well, there you go. Now you have a roadmap of how to sell your local paper, a national paper, or even an international paper. So on that note, Hasina Momtaz, thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your time as well.